You found the Backup Wrap Up, your go to podcast for all things backup, recovery, and cyber recovery. In this episode, we challenge the notion that cloud versus tape is an either or proposition. I saw this LinkedIn post claiming that LTO library robots are the only robots not making things easier in 2025, and it got my attention. He suggested that tape is too slow and unreliable compared to cloud for active archives, which got me a little worked up. Here's the thing. If you're putting data in cloud's cheaper tiers, guess what? It's probably sitting on tape anyway. Prasanna and I break down, I think, a real comparison: cost, access time, data integrity, and location considerations. But honestly, I just start by rejecting the premise of the question, because it's probably on tape if it's in the cloud. I hope you enjoy the episode. By the way, if you don't know who I am, I'm W. Curtis Preston, aka Mr. Backup, and I've been passionate about backup and recovery for over 30 years, ever since I had to tell my boss that we had no backups of that database that we just lost. I don't want that to happen to you, and that's why I do this podcast. On this podcast, we turn unappreciated backup admins into cyber recovery heroes. This is the Backup Wrap Up. Welcome to the show. Hi, I'm W. Curtis Preston, aka Mr. Backup, and I have with me a guy who has been flaunting his new job in my face, Prasanna Malaiyandi. How's it going, Prasanna?
I'm good, Curtis. I wouldn't call it flaunting, but I'm just excited about my new job.
Oh, you should see the campus. It's so amazing. And the coffee and the food and the food choices are so great. And I'm like, my coffee choices.
I see that. I see your coffee choice in the corner.
Yeah. Let's see if I tilt the camera. That's my new espresso machine, and you can see at the bottom, right? For those of you watching on YouTube, it has a little shelf with a drawer of coffee choices.
And so I think people, you should watch, or listeners, you should watch the podcast on YouTube and keep an eye on that shelf and see how many go missing every single time you watch between episodes to see how big of a caffeine habit Curtis has.
Yeah. Curtis definitely has a caffeine habit. But the rules are that if you get coffee at a breakfast place and then you come home, those coffees, they don't count together. You can't count them together. Because if you did, that would be a lot. But
have you ever thought about injecting coffee directly into your veins?
I don't think that would work out well. So today's topic is not coffee. Today's topic is about tape versus cloud. And cloud versus tape.
Why is it versus? Because in the last episode we talked about how the cloud is probably using tape.
Don't be jumping to the punchline, dude.
No, I'm just restating. You said cloud versus tape.
Yes, and that is the name of the show, of the episode. And the reason it's cloud versus tape is that all of this started with one guy's post.
Okay.
Right? So this all started from this LinkedIn post that I saw. And it had a headline that, a good headline in a post is solid, right?
Clickbait.
And the headline of this post caught me, right? And here's what it said. This answers your question. Why is this a versus episode? Here's what it said. LTO library robots. The only robots not making things easier in 2025.
What?
That's what it says. And he says, controversial? Nope. And then he goes on to basically do a tape versus cloud post.
Yeah.
Right.
And we'll include.
Go ahead.
And we'll include the link to the post in the show notes.
Yeah. So that all you tape. Well, actually, I don't know. Just because you're backup friendly doesn't mean you're tape friendly. You should be tape friendly if you listen to this podcast.
No, just so they can see what the original post was about.
Yeah. No, I want him to go comment on it. I mean, he'll like it because basically the Post is, advertising how amazing they are. First off, he makes two, I'll say, claims about tape. One of which I thought was totally out of line, and then the other, I think, is in the context of, in the context, it's not that big of a deal. But when we talk about, so his points, so he's basically suggesting, first off, he's saying cloud is better than tape for the concept of an active archive. Let me define active archive, and that is, well, it's somewhat self-defining, but a traditional archive is you make a copy and you put it on a shelf and you hope you never touch it. An active archive is secondary data, right? Maybe even tertiary, data of secondary or tertiary importance, but we might occasionally access it. Not rarely, but occasionally.
And
go ahead.
Just to chime in on that. So when you said active archive, I was like, that sounds like an oxymoron. Right? Because no one thinks active and archive together. Now, having worked in storage for a long time, right? Normally what we'd also call that is HSM, right? Hierarchical storage management, right?
Yes, I think HSM data would qualify. For that
where
concept,
older data sort of gets tiered off into lower costs, lower storage, just to keep it still visible, right, and accessible, but there is sort of a penalty of being able to read that data back, but from a client perspective, it's still available and usable.
Right. And it might not be fully HSM, right? Because the idea of HSM is that it just magically comes back, but it is this idea of an archive, which is that you're actively pulling stuff out on a regular basis, and as opposed to sort of the traditional, like you said, like true archive where you put it there and you never access it.
And just one example, and let me know if you think this makes sense for our listeners too, is like medical research, like DNA research, like these models and this data, scientific data that they collect, right? They may not actively need it, right, to use it on a day-to-day basis. They might need to store it because in some future point, they may need to be able to reference that data. And usually this data is very, very large data sets. And so you don't want to necessarily keep it stored on your primary storage system because of cost.
Yes. But you still want it. You want to make sure it stays around, and you want to be able to access it, right? There. By the way, there's an entire group called the Active Archive Alliance, which is a whole number of people, some of which listen to the show, that are basically vendors dedicated to this concept of the Active Archive. So he was basically suggesting that if you have an active archive, if you're going to regularly retrieve data from the archive, then again, according to the Post, you should put it in the cloud and not on tape, because cloud is better and tape is, his two claims are, too slow. And he basically implied that it was unreliable, right? He said, if you want that clip at your fingertips without the wait and the will it load anxiety, I was like, what is that? So basically he's saying it takes too long and it's not reliable. And so therefore you need to put it in the cloud. And
okay, keep going.
Yeah, well, that was the point of his post.
Okay.
And I know that one of the first things that's going to come to your mind is, if you put it in the cloud, it might indeed be on tape, right? So first off, there is no such thing as tape versus cloud. Yeah. It's really tape versus disk, but his post was about tape versus cloud, and so I thought it was a good topic to discuss, and also to just bring up the fact that if the listeners don't know, if you're using the lower cost tiers of cloud storage, you are most likely storing your data on tape.
Go listen to our episode a couple episodes ago. We just talked about this.
Did we? I forgot.
Yes, we did, Curtis.
Do you remember what the title of that episode was?
I don't think it's been published yet, but it...
Oh, is that what it is?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
We did.
And we did. We did talk about what...
is tape backup dead?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So, yes. Right. So we did mention that in the tape backup dead episode, which is related to this episode. And there we made a lot of really good points in that episode, which we're not going to take the time to rehash in this episode. This is mainly about, first off, this idea of, is cloud better than tape? And first off, I'm going to say that I reject the premise, because it's really disk versus tape, right? Not cloud versus tape.
But even if I just so I think that is definitely a fair angle to look at it. In my mind, when you said cloud versus tape, the one thing or a couple things popped to mind, right? So one is storing data on cloud. If your infrastructure that you need to access the data is on premises, you're going to need to pull the data back and send the data up. And that's going to take time, especially if these are active archive scenarios, like I had mentioned, where you might have a very large data set, right? So one is, it's not going to be instantaneous, right? Versus something that might be on premises, like your tape library, potentially.
Yeah, that's a great point, right? So if we are talking, like if we don't reject the premise and we say cloud versus tape, like we're setting aside the fact that cloud is often tape, right? If we're talking about putting your data in a cloud vendor versus putting your data in a tape library that you control, yes, access could be an issue depending on the size of the things that we're talking about. It's not instantaneous to move things back and forth from the cloud. Yeah. Potentially, this is mitigated by moving where your infrastructure is.
Yep.
If your infrastructure is up, if you're storing the data in AWS and your compute happens to be in AWS, it's a much shorter trip.
Yeah.
But that is a really valid point.
Yeah. And then so I had two more points. The second one is cost, right? He doesn't necessarily talk about that, but
he doesn't talk about cost at all.
Right. But if, say, you wanted not the very lowest cost storage that's in the cloud, but something that's a little bit more practical, right? Mm-hmm. You're paying per month, per gigabyte.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
If you have very, very large data sets and multiple very, very large data sets, the cost can quickly add up, especially if this is archive, which implies that you're keeping it for a very, very, very long time.
Yes. And that's a really good point, right? And that's been historically when I'll quickly summarize the things that I talked about in the other episode: cost, initial integrity, and long-term integrity, right? So tape is much, 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 much cheaper than, literally in all three categories. It is at least one, sometimes two, sometimes three orders of magnitude better in that category. So, and in fact, I've regularly made the claim that if what we're talking about is long-term storage, that set aside cloud for the minute. Even if we looked at disk that we're going to own, which we know long-term is going to be cheaper than doing it in the cloud, assuming we have 100% utilization and all of that, right? But if the disk were free, right, it would still be more expensive than tape.
Yep.
Why would I say that?
Power, cooling, people.
Power and cooling.
Yep.
Right? And data center space.
Yep.
Right? Because it's going to be bigger than the tape. It's going to create way more power need, or it's going to have way more power needs, which then creates way more heat, which then has to be dissipated through cooling.
Yep.
Right? So that's why I've often made the argument, again, cloud is a different argument, but when it comes to cost, even if disk were free, tape would be cheaper.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Because you just talked about it, right? Because tape is, you write it and then it just sits there, right? You're not powering it, you're not cooling it, right? In fact, it should be, I think in the last episode we talked about, right? It should be stored at room temperature, right?
Right.
So
right. And the drives, unlike disk, the drives aren't consuming much power when they're not being used, right? And they're consuming, and when the drive is doing something, it's consuming less power than the same amount of disk, right? The tapes consume zero power, right? So a tape library that is, this big and a tape library that's this big consumes the same amount of power.
And for people listening to the podcast, Curtis basically showed maybe 1.5 feet versus 6 feet.
Yeah, there you go.
So yes,
for those listening at home, go ahead.
Nope.
Well, it just cost is definitely the number one thing because then when we talk about cloud, your point is super, super valid, because if we're talking cloud, you are paying every single month forever, as long as you're keeping that archive in there, and you're paying by the gigabyte, and that per gigabyte price is that you're paying every month is likely it's probably similar to the acquisition price of tape.
Yeah.
Right. Meaning just buying that one tape.
Yeah.
And you're going to pay that per month.
Yeah. And then the other thing to also mention is active. So you talked about active archive. So I'm assuming you are going to be reading the data periodically.
Right.
Right. Which means that depending on what storage tier or storage class you use for the cloud, you may have different costs for reading the data back. Right. Which could be very, very expensive for the lowest cost tier of storage.
Right. Yeah, they do charge you quite a bit, because the idea of depending on the class that you put in. So your choice is pay more per gigabyte per month and be able to access it no problem, or pay less per gigabyte per month and then pay a lot when you access it.
Yeah.
Pick your poison, right? Yeah. And also the cost per month is also going to usually depends on how quickly you will be able to access it.
Yep.
At least it is in AWS. I know, like in Google storage, Google Cloud Storage,
the same, I think. Across.
It's the same access time, but they just charge you, again, based on when you access it, right?
I have one more.
Yeah.
Okay, so the third one, right? My third point about this, just cloud versus tape. Mm-hmm. Assuming, once again, that you're running on premises, right? And you're storing your data in the cloud. Right? We talked about the cost of storing it up there, the cost of the time it takes to transfer it up and down. Mm-hmm. One other cost we didn't talk about is egress cost. Right?
I thought I'm going to play dumb here. I thought we just talked about that. The charge.
No, that's just to restore the data, but to actually transfer the data,
right,
is a cost as well. So, for instance, if your infrastructure exists on premises, to pull your data from the cloud back to your data center, they're going to typically charge you. Right? Yeah. Which you now need to factor in. And once again, this goes all the way back to the active archive definition, right? You're reading this data at some frequency, right? It's not just staying up there and you're never getting it back, right? So in addition to paying the restore cost, right, you also have to pay the data transfer out cost or egress cost, and that could add up, especially if your data set is large.
Yeah, that's and just to sort of put in, I don't know, simpler language, those last two things, you're paying, if you're using infrequently accessed object storage, and that's part of the cost, that's the, like Glacier Deep Archive, for example, is one of these things where you get a really cheap monthly cost, but that's based on the idea that you're never going to bring any of it back.
Yeah.
Right. But if you do bring it back, then they charge you extra just to take it out of the archive. And then you're right, there is then the cost to bring it back. So that first cost would happen whether it leaves the cloud or not.
Yeah.
Like if they transferred it within Google or within AWS. And then that second cost is when you bring it back to your environment.
Yep.
Yeah, these are really good points. The other, and just really quickly to talk about the data integrity issue, tape is better at writing ones and zeros than disk, flash, right? What's with the face?
No, I continue.
WTF? Why the face?
No. So I'm thinking though. So I agree that it is better than.
There's no agree or disagree. It's just a scientific fact.
But I do wonder with object storage and how they do sharding and everything else, if their error rates are actually better than single disc, maybe not quite approaching single tape level, right? But because of the...
It's a good point. I don't mean to cut you off, but that's a good point. But I don't think so. Because when the initial corruption happens with a single bit, they can possibly... The point is that when they read the data back, they might not notice that the corruption has happened, right? It's just there are all kinds of error correction that you can do on top, but again, it's just that you can try to mitigate some of these problems, but it's a simple fact that disk makes way more errors when writing ones and zeros to magnetic media than tape does. It's literally 2 orders of magnitude better from the best disc to the worst tape, right?
Yes.
And then the nicer tapes is another 1 or even 2 orders of magnitude better,
I agree,
right?
that it's not going to be the same. I'm just wondering if it's better when we talk about object storage, right? Or a system like AWS versus like your traditional disk, right? Because of the additional protections that some of these storage vendors create. I'm not going to say it's going to beat tape, but I do wonder if maybe the delta is just a little bit better.
I follow what you're saying. I'm just saying, well, so here's the thing. People write to tape with object storage too. And we write to disk with object storage too, right? So if we've got object storage on both sides, then it's still better on tape than disk.
Yes, that is true.
Right? I mean, we can argue, we'd have to do a lot of research to figure out how much better it is, but the simple fact is it's better, right? Yes. By the way, I like you challenging me on this, but that's just it. And then let's talk about the other thing. And again, you could argue that maybe object storage would notice this, and it may notice it, but it might not. Yeah. And that is long-term bit rot. Bit rot is way worse on disk than it is on tape.
Yep.
Yes, possibly. And some of the object storage stuff would maybe notice that the bit rot happened and then self-repair. Yeah. I would hope so. But the alternative, the common belief is that tape is bad for long-term storage and tape is bad at writing data in the first place. And I'm saying it's actually better.
Yeah.
Right?
No, I don't disagree with that at all.
Yeah.
The other thing to also remember is cloud isn't something magical. It's just someone else's server.
Yeah.
Right?
It's not magical. But let's talk about his actual.
Sorry,
systems, right?
Sorry. That's those are the thoughts that ran through my head when you said cloud versus tape, and I was like, huh.
So he has 2 claims. One is he's saying that it takes too long to if you're doing an active archive kind of thing, it takes too long to load. And second, it's that it might not load. Okay.
Does he talk about what does he mean by takes too long?
First.
Okay. Oh.
Well, let's do the second one first because I think it's just total bunk.
Okay.
I said, what are you talking about? Right? Maybe if we're talking about LTO from 10, 15 years ago.
Or it's that one tape drive that you had at that one company you worked for like 25 years ago where you would write it, you would put it out, and you'd put it in a different one, and it wouldn't work?
Yeah.
But that was like 25, 30 years
ago. We've worked on that, right? And there was, when LTO was early, there was this concept of a lost leader, right? Where, but it was fixable, right? Your data wasn't in question. It was fixable, and it was also rare. Whereas when something bad happens to a disk, it's not fixable. You just swap it out, right?
Yeah.
So this idea that it might not load, I was like, come on, man! Like, what are you talking about? That's just a FUD that has no. As many tapes as I have had in my life, unless we go back to the early days, I don't have any memory of a tape that just wouldn't load that I couldn't fix.
Yeah.
So, but the second one is it's both a valid and an invalid claim, and that is that disk will take longer. I'm sorry,
the first
tape will take longer to load than disk. So it's both it's valid and it's invalid for multiple reasons. One, that I think even in an active archive situation, the idea is this stuff got archived and now you're bringing it back. The average load time of a tape is around 2.5 minutes last time I checked. And so if you've archived it, that means you haven't looked at it in, right?
The expectation is very low.
The expectation is very low. If it comes back in 2.5 minutes, what's the problem?
Like
right?
Glacier Deep Archive, I think it's 12 hours.
Yeah.
Right? For normal restore time. You can pay extra to get it back faster, but
yeah. And by the way, I can't prove this because I don't work there, and if I did work there, I probably wouldn't be able to tell you. When they designed Glacier and in Glacier Deep Archive, they designed that SLA with tape in mind.
Yeah.
Right? Why is it 12 hours if it's disk? Why is it any kind of hours if it's disk? It's clearly tape. And by the way, that means it's tape on a shelf, meaning it's not tape in a tape robot. Right?
Yeah.
Because why would it need to be 12 hours? Maybe it's there's it's
buffering,
if it's a high volume library, there's a buildup of requests for tapes, but
we don't know exactly what they're doing. This is just
we don't know exactly what they're doing, right?
Yeah.
But I don't think it's a valid complaint to say it's going to be 2 to 3 minutes to get my file back, the file that I haven't looked at in 6 months. Yeah. I just don't think that's a valid complaint. The expectation is that, you're even in an active archive, if you're going to put it on tape or in the cloud, which may be on tape, there's an understanding there that you're putting it in a place that's going to require some effort to get it back. You're not going to do that for stuff that you might need right away.
Yeah.
You're going to put stuff there. Even if it's an active archive, even if it's a full HSM system, you're not going to put stuff on tape or cloud that you might need tomorrow.
Yeah.
This is I might need this in 6 months.
Yeah.
And again, I just think, if you've waited 6 months to pull the file out, if it comes out in 3 minutes from now, I don't see that as a problem.
Yep.
And if it is a problem, then I would suggest that you've got a bad design.
Yeah. You probably don't want to be actively archiving data.
Yeah. Yeah. You need a 3-tiered archive. Then you need a disk archive. You need whether it's cloud or on-prem disk, you need a disk cache to your truly old stuff part, right?
Yeah.
So that's why when I read this thing, I didn't get hot and bothered, but I hearkened back to the tape sucks, move on bumper sticker from your former employer.
Oh wait,
do you have it?
I don't quite have that one, but I do. Oh, wait. I have.
What is it? What is that? Oh, that is not cool. It says it was a truck that said lost tapes on the side.
And then on the back, it does say.
Where? Was it a bumper sticker that says tape sucks, move on? Yeah. I mean, you could argue that was a very successful marketing campaign because we still remember it all these years later. But I remember it because I thought it was BS, right? I mean, tape did suck. Tape does suck in certain ways.
Yeah. If you use it in the wrong way, it will suck.
Yeah.
Just like anything else. So any other technology, use it in the wrong way or for an unintended use case, and there will be issues.
So if we talk about cloud, really what it is, what the discussion should be is on-prem versus off-prem, right?
Yeah.
Because cloud is tape. So if I'm putting the data in the cloud, especially older, because he said it's talking about active archive, I'm probably putting it on tape. So it's not tape versus cloud. It's on-prem tape versus off-prem cloud, whatever that happens to be.
Is that the thing, or is it disk versus tape and on-prem versus off-prem?
Sure, right? I would just argue that, if you need the stuff, like that, then both tape and long-term archive is not the place to do.
Yeah.
To put it. If you have access times measured in seconds, then you shouldn't be putting it on either tape or Glacier Deep Archive and the like.
Yeah.
Right? Are we in agreement there?
I am, but
yeah.
The only thing
with the you always have a big butt. You know that? By the way, that's the dirtiest line in Pee-wee's Herman's Big Adventure. She says, "I know, but," and he goes, "Everybody I know has a big butt."
The reason I mentioned that is, even if so, you said tape versus Glacier Deep Archive, right, or whatever else in the cloud.
It's something like that,
right? Yeah. I think there are cases where you could still leverage. Oh, but that's still considered tape, though.
No, what I'm saying is the access time of Glacier Deep Archive.
Okay, necessitates
is similar. It's actually worse than tape, right? So if what he's saying is you get a better access time, well, then that means he's not using any of the tiers that have massive savings. Yeah. So now we're talking huge difference in
it's
cost,
S3
right?
or it's like normal
maybe
S3.
S3 infrequent access, right?
Yep. But that's still very, very, very expensive.
It's very expensive, right?
Yeah.
And then we're not talking about. I'm saying the closest thing to compare tape to is Glacier Deep Archive and the like.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm saying that if you need access time measured in seconds, you should not be putting it on tape or there. You should be putting it on-prem object storage or cloud object storage.
Yep.
This post got me all worked up.
Just like, are you forgetful? Because literally 3 minutes ago, you're like, oh yeah, no, this post didn't get me hot, and
it got me all worked up. I was like, come on, man. Doing my Biden impersonation. Come on, man. Yeah. So it's about your requirements. And if your requirements are measured in seconds, you're right. Tape's the wrong place. But so is Glacier Deep Archive.
But even if your time is measured in seconds,
yeah,
also make sure you understand where your data exists. Because even if you had used, say, infrequent access S3 with time measured in seconds, if you have to pull the data back on premises, you're going to blow it out of the water. It doesn't matter. Right?
Yeah. Exactly.
So the only time it makes sense to use cloud and S3 infrequent access for this particular use case where you need seconds is if your source data or your compute also runs in the cloud.
Yes. Good point. Yes. You are so right, sir.
Thank you. Can I have another?
My new job. Oh, the memories. The shout out to my fellow shellbacks. Somebody knows what that means, but most people won't. Anyway, I'm a golden shellback for those of you that know what that means. The rest of you, feel free to Google it. Anyway, it means that I was both hazed and I hazed. The world's oldest hazing ritual. Formerly sponsored by the U.S. Navy. And now it's a shadow of his former self. Because apparently now it's bad to beat people.
Oh, Curtis.
I kid. All right. Well, thanks for having the chat. This was fun. You know, it would have been more fun if the guy was here
to defend his position, but that's why we do the podcast, so then we can make fun of people without them being on the podcast.
Yeah. And then he could record his own podcast where he talks about us and how stupid we are. Anyway, all right. Well, thanks to the listeners. You are why we do this, that, and I don't know. Prasanna and I got nothing else better to do. that is a wrap. The Backup Wrap-Up is written, recorded, and produced by me, W. Curtis Preston. If you need backup or DR consulting, content generation, or expert witness work, check out backupcentral.com. You can also find links for my O'Reilly books on the same website. Remember, this is an independent podcast, and any opinions that you hear are those of the speaker and not necessarily an employer. Thanks for listening.